For over half a century, the American public has been warned they're being targeted with misinformation and disinformation campaigns. From McCarthyism back in the late 1960s to the Hamilton 68 established in 2017 after Donald Trump's historic upset in the 2016 elections.
In his recent piece titled A Guide to Understanding the Hoax of the Century, writer Jacob Siegel explores 13 ways of looking at disinformation and how the government has poured billions into fanning the flames of so-called hoaxes. Here to elaborate on this piece is Jacob himself. Welcome, Jacob. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So Tablet has emerged as one of the most important publications in terms of really providing space to countermand exactly what you describe in the piece, the sort of censorship campaign, the hoax of the century. Why don't you tell us a little bit about how this piece came about, and then give us the sort of Cliff Notes summary for people who haven't had a chance to read it yet?
I would say that the piece emerged really directly out of the kind of Tablet milieu and out of conversations I was having with other Tablet editors, Alana Newhouse, David Samuels, and other Tablet writers like Lee Smith. And Lee in particular really broke open the Russiagate story at Tablet. And from the very beginning, from early February 2017, I believe, Lee was already pointing out what we all now know to be true, which is not simply that the claims of collusion between Donald Trump and the Kremlin were false, but that they were the products of a deliberate deception led by intelligence agencies, U.S. intelligence agencies, that is, working in coordination with Democratic Party operatives and kind of cutout organizations like Fusion GPS and Perkins Coie. So this was a worldview, a sort of grand unifying theory that was very much, in some sense, collaborative, but the particular aspects of the disinformation system also came out of my own experiences dealing with the big data solutionism that I saw in Afghanistan and the ways in which data and information systems came to replace traditional sources of wisdom, statesmanship, strategy. And I think that's very much what happened with disinformation. It was an attempt to control all information, a strategy of kind of digital omniscience as politics.
I think it's important always to remind people of how popular that narrative became that Trump won because of Russian influence, predominantly on social media, actually Facebook. This idea that was, put forth by intelligence officials, former intelligence officials, seized upon by the mainstream media, and then hammered home night after night after night after night from like the 2016 to 2018 period. And I don't know this genuinely. Do the people who read that, who watched that night after night, has it sunk in for them that we've now had all this subsequent great reporting that the influence on social media was not nearly as vast as we thought, that it wasn't targeted at the exact right voters, that a lot of people who were flagged as Russian bots are not actually Russian bots, that the disinfo cops have gotten it wrong time and time again? That's well known to viewers of this program. I don't know if that's something that the audiences of like MSNBC and CNN have actually had to reckon with, because I'm not sure the hosts have reckoned with it yet.
Look, the answer is no, they haven't reckoned with it. And also that you've just hit on what is really the great crime here. And the great crime is not simply the deception. The great crime is that tens of millions of Americans were co-opted and brought into that deception and made co-conspirators, essentially, because they, for reasons that I think are quite understandable, trusted the U.S. intelligence community. They trusted the MSNBC hosts, which is maybe, a distinction not worth making anymore between MSNBC hosts and the U.S. intelligence community. But the point is that tens of millions of people who are not crazy ideologues, who are not professional spies or partisan hacks, were brought into this because they were told that the president was a Kremlin agent by people who they were supposed to trust, And this had a profoundly destructive and deranging effect on the American political landscape that we're going to be living with and seeing the wreckage of for decades.
My question would be, you describe a sort of very totalizing view, almost a hegemony, a hegemonic view, right? A collusion between all of these different entities. Like you said, I totally agree with you. What already is the difference between, is MSNBC capable of bringing a skeptical lens to anybody they interview from the intelligence community, right? Jury's no longer out. At the same time, we do have in America a very robust conservative media atmosphere, ecosystem that has been quite skeptical of a lot of this from the beginning. We now, we're having hearings in Congress from Republicans pushing back on exactly the stuff that you're pointing to here. And of course, former President Trump's base, who never bought into it in the first place. Do you not take seriously the idea that there is a very robust resistance to the resistance taking place, on Fox News, on talk radio, and conservative podcasts, and now, among Republicans in the House?
No, I do take that seriously, but I think what you're describing is a resistance with little power over the decision-making and sense-making apparatus in the United States. So this is not to suggest that it's without power. It has clearly its own power, both in financial, and economic terms. It generates a lot of money. It has some degree of representation inside of Congress, though frankly not all that much, even if it's increasing. But that robust resistance to the resistance, which first of all, grew in part as a result of the kind of hegemony of the resistance, is also still functionally excluded from the actual, I shouldn't say the actual, from the official centers of power in the United States. And if you look at the language that was used in this war against disinformation from the very beginning, by the agencies that were leading it, like the State Department's Global Engagement Center, and later by Department of Homeland Security. And in fact, this is the language used in the Democratic National Committee's, I believe it's the 2020 platform. But the bottom line is they refer to a whole of society effort. And what they mean when they talk about this whole of society effort is that they're yoking together both the federal agencies, Silicon Valley tech platforms, Wall Street funders, and the universities and the press. So the hegemony is not conspiratorial. It's not particularly, or it's not far-fetched at all. Actually, it's the way they describe it. It was their aim, and they achieved it.
I always say not to totally despair. Don't totally give up hope. America has, the U.S. has something that no other country does that offers a robust protection for dissent, for not criminalizing misinformation or whatever you want to call it. That is obviously the First Amendment. A tool for protecting free speech that has gotten more fine-tuned over time. The Supreme Court is very pro-free speech, very First Amendment. However, the problem we've seen now, and I do think some of these things going on come close to violating the First Amendment, if not doing so outright, talking about the amount of pressure placed on social media companies by government bureaucrats, to censor speech. But some of it's willing on the part of tech. It runs the gamut from how willing do they really think it is when they're also being threatened with, they're getting summoned to appear in congressional hearings where they're going to, punish the political figures are going to punish tech companies for not going along with what the bureaucrats are telling them to do. So the First Amendment is a good thing. We have that, but it's not been enough so far to prevent this total criminalization of speech based on a false perception that misinformation is so the people saying that are in fact misinforming people about the extent of the misinformation problem, but they're not going to be held accountable.
But what we are looking at is specifically, explicitly, a new system of political power intended to replace the United States Constitution and constitutional protections. So the whole premise of misinformation and disinformation is that the notion of free speech enshrined in the Bill of Rights is antiquated, can no longer be upheld in a borderless digital era in which information itself is now deadly, and attacks take place in cyberspace through memes, etc. And this is literally the view that's been expressed by the former Clinton White House officials, by numerous disinformation experts, in a New York Times Magazine piece from 2020 that I cite in my piece for Tablet. So the idea that the disinformation censorship apparatus is intended to replace the previous old American system of free speech, which is now antiquated and a kind of relic, is quite explicit. It's built into all of this. A. B. The problem is, and I agree with you about the strength of the First Amendment protection and the Supreme Court's position, and I would never counsel despair ever in any circumstance. But I do counsel honesty. And what we're looking at here also is a technical means of circumventing that. Because if you carry out these campaigns of mass automated censorship that are occurring outside of the public view without any transparency through these very opaque and convoluted mechanisms like the Election Integrity Project and these sort of ostensibly independent nonprofits that are really government cutouts, you're not making the actions available for constitutional or legal checks because you're hiding them.
Very
right,
sobering,
Jacob,
very alarming.
can you help? You mentioned that you're seeing echoes here to something you observed when you were in Afghanistan. First of all, thank you for your service. Can you just draw that out a little bit? Explain to us what it was that you observed that you see now as the beginnings of this movement.
There was a total lack of strategic vision in Afghanistan by the time I arrived, certainly in 2012, and I think for some time before that. So the United States had explicitly abandoned the idea that victory was achievable, and in fact, in the kind of fashionable or sophisticated defense establishment thinking of the time, victory was a kind of outmoded idea, and postmodern wars didn't achieve victory. And so the bottom line is, we had no reason to be in Afghanistan, especially after 2004. I'm not making an argument against the initial invasion. That's a whole different question. But I am saying that by 2012, when I had arrived, and there was obviously a lack of any ordering strategic vision that put sensible, achievable goals in place, and we were all invested in these very obvious untruths and delusions, like the training of the Afghan National Security Forces, which, I was writing about this in 2013. I was writing about the hollowness. It was the very first article I wrote when I got back from Afghanistan was about the hollowness of the Afghan National Security Forces and the fact that they were cutting side deals sensibly, in many respects, cutting side deals with the Taliban, who they understood would be the power that would remain after the United States left. Now, I'm not that smart. I certainly didn't have access that other people didn't have. I was just saying what anybody could see who was in Afghanistan during the period I was there. The way that this relates to the disinformation apparatus is that one of the primary means of sort of covering all of this up at the time was this absolutely kind of almost otherworldly system of surveillance and information control, where we just acquired so much data about everything in Afghanistan and fed it into these centralized databases that were constantly receiving more data through not only drone or what was called ISR surveillance, but also through things like biometrics, and through reports that were being fed into these systems. That basically the idea that information control was its own means of winning the war, or of accomplishing something, that if we could just sort of get all of the data in one place, whoever controlled the most data was the victor. This became the sort of unspoken assumption of the war. And of course, what that led to is what we all saw, which was a chaotic, if in my opinion, still entirely correct U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan that, that led to the Taliban regaining power essentially without a shot being fired. So we had the most powerful information control systems ever known, ever created. And that's what they got us.
Very insightful. Jacob, thank you so much for spending some time with us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me.